Good evening and welcome back to Página Governo with me, Nélia Chaves. As always, this program is a space for dialogue between the government and the citizens, promoted by the Office of the Government Spokesperson under the Ministry of the Presidency of the Council of the Ministers. So tonight, we are honored to welcome two distinguished guests, Mr. André Roncaglia, Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, representing a group of countries including Timor-Leste, and Mr. Hélder Lopes, the current governor of the Central Bank of Timor-Leste. So together we will explore how Timor-Leste is facing the global challenges while preparing for a stronger, more resilient and sustainable economy. So good evening and thank you both for being here with us. So before I start, I would like to ask Mr. Roncaglia to briefly introduce yourself, please.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. My name is André Roncaglia. I am the Executive Director representing Timor-Leste at the International Monetary Fund. So basically, my work is to facilitate the communication between the institution and the authorities here in Timor-Leste. I have the honor to work alongside Governor Lopes, and also the Minister of Finance. And basically, the idea is that the fund, when engaging Timor-Leste, that understands its challenges, understands the circumstances that it faces, and particularly how it receives the shocks and the different circumstances in the world economy. And the fund basically does three things. It does surveillance, which is basically identify risks to the global economy, but also to the countries. It can lend money if the country is in need in a situation of a crisis, but it also helps the country to build what we call capacity. So it's the ability to raise statistics, to have an adequate fiscal policy, how the government spends and collects money, but also how the central bank deals with the central banking and guarantee a stable economy and a stable financial system. So my role, honored to be representing Timor-Leste at the board of directors of the fund.
Thank you. Let's start by looking at the global situation. The world economy has been facing a lot of uncertainty, marked by political tensions, shift in trades, and fluctuations in the energy prices. I would like to direct the first question to you, Mr. Roncaglia. From your perspective, how are these global challenges affecting small and vulnerable economies like Timor-Leste?
So whenever we have global shocks, basically to small open economies, the impact comes very fast, it lasts longer, and it takes to hit very hard. So talking about in general, there are three channels. The first one is imported inflation. So depending on how much the economy depends on imports for food, for fuel, for energy, and other inputs for production, then whenever you have a price increase, it translates almost immediately into an increase in inflation. That's why we need a central bank that is paying attention to this, is controlling the situation in a way to, let's say, reduce or mitigate the damage that the inflation can do by sort of cushioning it, or say, trying to mitigate the effects. The second channel is what we call fiscal volatility. So this may impact how the government can collect revenues. And if the government cannot collect enough revenues, then it faces a difficulty in fulfilling its expenditures, which may come in the sense of maintaining public services, but also social transfers that are very important for the population. And the third channel is what we call the financing and confidence risk. So investors world around may look to small open economies and say they're more fragile, so I may not put my money there now. And this creates a problem of money coming in or eventually even money coming out of the country, which can make the situation a little shaky, to say the least. So these are the three main channels that affect small open economies.
These challenges, which one tend to have longer lasting effects and which can be managed more quickly?
Well, it will depend on the structure of the economy. So if the economy is very dependent on import of food, import of fuels, then this tends to be the most sensitive part of the shock. And what the economy can do is what we call build buffers, which can come in the form of stocks of food or fuel, but also in the form of eventually creating the basis for what we call creating more productive space. So people are producing more food inside the country, trying to get different sources of energy. So instead of relying only on fossil fuels, you can have solar energy, you can have wind energy, you can have different sources of energy. But basically, usually for small open economies, these are the two main channels.
Mr. Governor, from a domestic policy perspective, which of these challenges is currently the most critical for Timor-Leste? Trade, energy, or finance?
Okay, I think first of all, we are very fortunate to have Director André here for sharing his perspective on how these global shocks affect to the global economy and particularly to Timor-Leste, which is one of his constituency members. With regards to your question of how this global shock affect to us, I'll probably focus on the inflation. So if you look at Timor-Leste's economy, especially on the inflation, CPI basket, where food is actually dominant in our basket. So actually the shocks bring twofolds or affect us in twofold. One is the rise in energy prices or energy price, and second is on the food price. So if these two prices increase, where we are the economy that is rely heavily on import, then that will probably surge the inflation quickly. And as he said, could stay last or long because of our structure of economy where we don't have enough domestic production that could probably contain some of the imported inflations. So with that, we, the central bank, continue monitoring how the global food price and commodity energy price actually change over time and how it affects or transmission to our economy. We also work closely with our colleagues from the fiscal department, in this case the Ministry of Finance, on what measures they need to be taken in order to help or protect the most vulnerable people that is actually affected by these external shocks. But that will subject to the fiscal space that we have. So I think to answer your question, the one that really affect to us in terms of this external shock is actually the inflation or the price increase. And I think we have seen this where the energy price, the fuel prices actually increase, and the government is taking the fuel subsidy. Hopefully that will probably address some of the downside risk that people are actually bearing. But I think the most important thing is, as Andrea just mentioned, that it's very important for us to understand how this shocks transmission to our economy affect to the people, and we need to design policy that could help our people, but we also need to make sure, bear in mind that the policy that we design are actually we design in the sense of we are capable to implement the policy, and then we have to withdraw the policy or come to the normal situation when things are normal.
In our country, in a country like ours, where we use the US dollar, what are the risks of relying mainly on government spending to stabilize the economy?
So, linking using the US dollar to inflation, with the current situation where the external shock is actually affecting or transmitting to our economy, I will probably say right now we actually benefit from using US dollar. Why? For example, compare US dollar with rupiah of Indonesia, where actually most of our import is coming. Indonesia's rupiah is actually depreciate a lot compared to dollar. So in this case, we actually contain some of the imported inflation that's supposed to come from Indonesia. So that is why, even though we see the inflation will probably surge or increase a little bit, but imagine if we don't have the US dollar, then probably inflation will probably skyrocketing. So I think from that perspective, US dollar is helping us in terms of containing some inflation. If I put in the broader context of how US dollar helps us, from the perspective of we invest our petroleum fund in mostly in US dollar asset. I think that also help us a little bit in the sense of given that many many investors are actually looking for the safe haven, so they go to the US market, investing in US, and that will actually make the US dollar index strong, and that help us as well.
So beyond managing the external pressures, the key question is how can we build a stronger economy for our future generations? So one of the biggest challenges for Timor-Leste now is diversifying its economy. Mr. Governor, how can our financial system better support this diversification agenda, especially when it comes to helping business grow and creating more job opportunities?
Correct. So in that sense, access to finance is very important. We continue try to work together with our industry, especially the banking sector and also beyond the banking sector, to help our economy by channeling, the liquidities that they have to the economy through credit. The challenge that we have right now is that, we have not a lot, but quite a number of liquidity sitting in the financial industry, but it's not really channeled to the economy because of the perception of high risk lending environment. So in that sense, we, the central bank, is trying to fix the lending environment together with the government, and hopefully that will help both the supply and demand in the lending market, to meet, and that will support the economy diversification. We cannot go directly into how to diversify the economy, but our responsibility is how to create conditions where the financial liquidity could be channeled to the economy, especially to the potential sector that could diversify our economy, so that the private sector can use this money, to build their businesses, and hopefully they could contribute to the economy diversification. I think, just to make a reference, last month, once we launched our annual economy report, our special edition of the report was on the private sector development. And then during the launching, we facilitated the dialogue between government and private sector. For us, that is extremely important because to diversify the economy, it should be done by the private sector. Government to facilitate, government to regulate, government to create conditions, but the main players should be the private sector. So that is why we try to play our advocacy role by trying to bring in these two big players together. But in the meantime, we will also like to make sure that access to finance is there in order to facilitate our private sector to help diversify the economy.
Thank you. Now I'd like to go to Mr. Roncaglia. Based on the international experience, what are the most realistic paths for countries like Timor-Leste to diversify their economy?
So small open economies usually have to rely first on the assets that they have. So in the case of Timor, you have a very young population, so we call it a demographic dividend. So most of the population is very young. So this creates a long path in which you have a very available working force. So this creates the opportunity to create jobs, to give opportunities to the people, invest a lot in education, healthcare, because this is all important to maintain a healthy labor force. Now, having a population goes just so far. The second part is you need to build what we call entrepreneurial capital. So entrepreneurs, the private sector, has to take its share of the responsibility of building a resilient economy, which in the case of Timor is a non-oil part of the economy. So rely on oil is very important, can give you a basis where to have a certain source of income, but you need to build the non-oil economy. And I think Timor is doing large strides in that regard, but the private sector is very important, as the governor just mentioned. So creating incentives for entrepreneurs is very important, and also to have them with a clear vision of where they want to take the different sectors. Now, that said, the third part is to target specific sectors that can unlock the productivity that's already here in the country. So the first one that I see is very direct is the agro-processing, agriculture, and agriculture-related activities. So basically, you already have this capital. You need to, of course, create a sector facilitate infrastructure, transportation, the ease of commerce, so create markets, which are very important. The second one, which for me is a low-hanging fruit as well for Timor, is the biodiversity that you have here. So coming from a country as well that have a huge biodiversity, the sector of tourism that can connect with the area of ecology, so ecotourism as they call, can bring a lot of opportunities, is very labor intensive. So you need a lot of people to work on this. And usually you can attract a lot of people from other places. So this gives also a source of income to the country. The third one is very important, is digital services. So everything connected to digitalization is very important, and it can create very fast response for the economy. So this is also something that I think Timor has a great opportunity to advance on. And finally, digital public services. So everything related to the public services is also a very rich source of opportunities for employment. And this you can use with the resources that you have, of course, and then can create a better, let's say, basis for the private sector to prosper. So you can facilitate the collection of revenues. You can understand which group of people need social transfers the best. So you can target social transfers to protect the most vulnerable. You can target subsidies to sectors that have public effects. So a few sectors sometimes the private sector doesn't have enough incentive to go in because the benefits, they tend to be shared with the population without them having to pay. So for instance, if you have a public park, so the public park, everybody enjoys the park, but who is paying for that? So whenever you have a public good, it is important that the government steps in, provides some subsidies so that service can be provided, but of course, incentivizing the private sector. So the idea now, I think in my view, in my understanding, is that Timor is very well placed to think strategy, to think the long term, how to build and diversify its economy based on what it has now. Once it begins to move forward, then other opportunities will open, other challenges will appear. But at this moment, I would go based on the studies of the fund. These seems to be 4 sectors that can unlock the productivity of the country.
Another key issue closely linked to our economy is how we manage our petroleum resources. As we all know, the petroleum fund is a central pillar of Timor-Leste economy, but it also raises important questions about sustainability and fairness for the future generations. So, Mr. Roncaglia, still with you, what role should funds like this play in balancing today's needs with the responsibility to future generations?
So let me start by saying that Timor-Leste is an example of what to do with this bounty that came to the country. So many other countries, and I'm a developmentalist economist, so I try to understand how economies can unlock their productive capacity so they can, what we call, raise their living standards. So how can they improve the productivity and make jobs more available, better jobs with better pay? And in the history of countries that find large oil reserves, the usual history is they get the money, you spend it all, and then they're left with nothing. So I think Timor did something very important, which is create the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is very important and can cushion a situation in which the country needs resources when they're not available. But also, as you mentioned, you have to think about the future generations because this asset is, of course, theirs as well. So the Timorese people that have not been born yet, they need to benefit from this. So the Petroleum Fund is very important to give the country an asset. What is an asset? Is a source of income. So when you have this, is what we call wealth. If you spend wealth, the capacity of this to generate income lowers. So the Petroleum Fund is important to generate wealth, which is now in the form of financial assets, so it can give the country a source of income. Now, the problem with having this wealth is that it can make the country, let's say, more comfortable. Instead of searching for new activities, searching for new opportunities. And I think this is where the importance of the fiscal framework comes. So if you identify how you can tax the citizens in a fair and a very, let's say, well-distributed way. So the most vulnerable pay less and the richer pay a little more. You can balance the budget without having to reach too much into the petroleum fund. Now, one thing is theory, another thing is reality. So whenever a country is, of course, trying to live itself from a situation of a low income and trying to reach higher levels of income so everybody can have more, the way you use the fund is very important. So let me bring a little bit of an international experience. We can go to Norway, which then found its oil reserves, built the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Today it's probably around $1.8 trillion. What they do is they invest largely in companies, they invest a lot in different opportunities, innovation, and they have a very important role in the country. So having this framework in which the fund can identify sectors and apply their capital in a way to boost productivity and to bring new sectors, this is the ideal. Now, to do that, of course, you have to have a fiscal framework that is in place, that is working adequately, and you're not using the resources in a way that is not productive. And this is the challenge for every country. Every country that has a petroleum fund faces this. Now, to close this answer, let me state that there's a lot of opportunity in holding this asset, but let me say it's not the only asset that Timor has, because Timor has a large standing forest, which covers more than 60% of the territory, which means that it has something to offer the world, which is clean air. And this is something that the world is starting to wake up to, which is to pay countries that have standing forests to help out in providing this public global good, which is the standing forest. So these two assets, I think, are very important, and they speak to the same issue, because the forests also provide a better welfare society for the next generations. So where our kids, our grandkids will live, they need to have clean air, they need to have good living conditions. So I think I would go in this direction in reflecting upon this.
So I would like to direct the next question to you, Mr. Governor. How does the petroleum fund influence our economy in particular terms, especially when it comes to maintaining stability and managing liquidity?
I think Andrea already explained everything, but I just want to complement by stating two very important things. So the petroleum fund is the lifeline of all Timorese. Second is the petroleum fund is very important for the macroeconomic stability of the country. Why? Because petroleum fund finance annual government budget over 80%. So every year, 80% of the financing is coming from the petroleum fund. So that and with the economy where the public expenditure is still very dominant, so actually the petroleum fund is playing very important role in this context. And the petroleum fund is the biggest component in ensuring our macroeconomic stability, because, for example, right now where we have the external shock, with this petroleum fund, they provide enough buffer to our government, to our country. So actually, for example, government decide to do the intervention of fuel subsidy. So imagine if we don't have the petroleum fund and the domestic revenue or the tax revenue is not there, then this policy measure may not be able to be implemented. So with this petroleum fund, provide buffer, provide stability to the government to design policy that could protect or could help people in any situation. So in that sort of, this is just an example of how the petroleum fund support the macroeconomic stability of the country and also to support the entire development in the country. But I think the situation here is how could we ensure that the petroleum fund is used for the current generation and the future generation. Just before I came here, I checked our petroleum fund balance. The balance increased to $18.4 billion now. So despite we have the big loss in March, but we actually rebound. The return is actually rebound a little bit in April, and hopefully we will continue to see the positive rebounding return from the investment, so that we can keep maintaining or increasing our petroleum fund balance, which is very important for our country. So how the petroleum fund could be used for serving the current generation, the current development. I think this is the question of two things. One is ensuring the petroleum fund sustainability. Second is widely used withdrawal from the petroleum fund in our state budget. That's very important. And that's why in this context, I will probably continue to advise the government that now ensuring the quality of expenditure, having the medium-term fiscal framework is extremely important because by having this, you can have the framework that will guide you, to promote the quality of expenditure and also how could you reduce your dependency to the petroleum fund. With regards to the future, whether the petroleum fund could serve its objective of intergenerational fund, actually two things that is very important. One is we need to make sure that the revenue influx from production of the oil and gas continue to be there. Hopefully the government will sort out the arrangement on the new production that is currently discussing with relevant stakeholders. And in the meantime, we, the central bank, as the fund manager, we need to make sure that our strategic asset allocation in the investment is there to have enough return from our investment in order to sustain our petroleum fund balance and sustainability for long term. But the most important thing is the government withdrawal from the petroleum fund has to be controlled, has to be widely used, because otherwise, if it is politically motivated and we do not control on this, that could probably jeopardize the sustainability of the petroleum fund. And one more thing that I will probably like to share with you and with everybody is that with the economy that that is dominated by the budget of the government, and in the other hand, we don't have the monetary policy. Petroleum fund is important because petroleum fund will sustain the fiscal, but we need to make sure that despite we have this buffer where we can tap in, they could sustain the fiscal, the budget of the government, but we need to make sure that contribute to the economy in a healthy manner, not overheating the economy, because otherwise you have the money, you want to spend, but in the meantime that could also create the downside risk for the people, and that's not good. So that is what we are trying to do together with our colleagues from the Ministry of Finance, that we need to protect the sustainability of the petroleum fund, but we also need to make sure the use of the petroleum fund is to the maximum benefit of our economy and our people.
Do you believe that our financial buffers like the petroleum fund and the foreign reserves are strong enough to protect us from the global shocks?
Right now, this is actually the biggest component of our resilience. The existing external shocks, we can actually we actually be able to sort of mitigate some of the risk because we have this buffer. For example, what I just mentioned, the government is providing fuel subsidy. The government can do that despite the domestic revenue is small. The government can do that because they have the petroleum fund. Imagine if the government would like to go beyond the fuel subsidy, providing some cash subsidy or food subsidy, they can still do that because of the petroleum fund that I just mentioned. So in that context, actually right now, the biggest component that contribute to our resilience against these external shocks is actually the petroleum fund.
Last thing that is very important, and the governor mentioned, is how can we widen the productive base of the economy?
The public sector need to address, in order to facilitate the economy.
Página do Governo, nessa iniciativa onde surge o gabinete de porta-voz do Governo. Também Bctl vai ao Ministério da Presidência do Conselho de Ministros. Deu-se entrevista com o membro do Governo Sira. O programa nune'e faz informação clara com a prioridade, política pública no resultado e áreas importantes sira nessa saúde, educação, agricultura, economia, turismo e emprego. O objetivo principal desse programa nune'e é que promove a transparência, comunicação eficaz, a aproximação entre o Governo e o povo de Timor-Leste, onde reforça a confiança na participação cidadã cidadania e desenvolvimento internacional.
In 2025, Timor-Leste's economy is projected to grow by 4.6%, slightly higher than 4.3% recorded in 2024. This expansion is mainly driven by robust public consumption, which is expected to rise by 8.6%, and private consumption, which is projected to grow by 3.1%. At the same time, private investment is also contributing to growth. It is estimated an increase of 8.8% this year. However, limited domestic productive capacity means the country continues to rely heavily on imports of goods and services, which is projected to rise by 4.7%. This dependence on imports partly offsets the positive effects of growth in 2025. Domestic inflation has remained very low in 2025. The annual average rate for the full year it is expected to be 0.5%, down from 2.1% last year. This inflation is mainly the result of declining global food and energy prices in recent months. In terms of the external sector, Timor-Leste continues to experience current account deficits, recording $701.4 million in 2025. This deficit is mainly driven by the persistent trade imbalance. For trade of goods, non-oil imports for the year 2025 totaled $960 million, representing an increase of nearly 4% compared to the previous year. When assessing imports by commodity, the 5 most imported items were: fuel tops the list at value of $207.8 million, with most of it coming from Taiwan. Vehicles are next at $115 million, largely from Indonesia. Then comes cereals at $66.3 million, mostly rice from India. Machinery amounted $63.6 million, primarily sourced from China. And finally, electrical equipment amounts $51.1 million, also from China. What about exports of goods? The non-oil exports amounted to only $41 million, consisting mainly of coffee at $35.8 million, while other agricultural products remain limited, with exports remaining far below imports. This has resulted in a large trade imbalance and significant economic leakage. Regarding remittances, until December 2025, inward worker remittances amounted to $182 million, down 14% compared to last year. Outward remittances reaches $109 million, an increase from the same period in 2024. Of the inward remittances, around 42% came from the UK, followed by Australia with 24% and South Korea with 20%. Moving to the public sector, domestic revenue reached $313.7 million in 2025, up 19.7% from last year, mainly driven by higher tax collections with an increase of 29%. However, compared to expenditures, the total government 2025 budget amounted to $2.62 billion, of which 69% or $1.82 billion was executed in 2025. A significant fiscal deficit emerged as a direct consequence of elevated government expenditures. This shortfall was financed by $1.45 billion withdrawal from the Petroleum Fund, higher than what's known as the estimated sustainable income. With respect to the Petroleum Fund, its balance rose to $18.61 billion by December 2025. This increase was driven mainly by strong investment returns of 1.77 million US dollars, equivalent to an annual rate of 9.92% in 2025, while oil revenues contributed only 36.12 million US dollars. Turning to financial sector, by December 2025, total deposits has risen to 1.91 billion US dollars, and credit to the economy continued to rise, reaching 724.4 million US dollars, resulting in a credit to GDP ratio of only 36.5%. However, lending rates stay high, with the average banking rate at 10.4% and the microfinance rate at around 29.8%. Let's look at the financial system. It holds 2.93 billion US dollars in total assets, but here's the catch: 1.69 billion US dollars that is held overseas. This high share of net foreign assets underscores the weak intermediation role of the financial system in channeling domestic saving into productive investments. This is the economic performance of Timor-Leste in 2025.
So now let's turn into another key issue that directly affects people's daily lives, which are inflation and the rising cost of living. Like we felt it, whether the food prices or the basic household expenses. So, Mr. Governor, still with you, how do you see the current inflation situation in Timor-Leste?
So the inflation, okay. Three things that is very important for looking at the inflation. One is the food price, second is the fuel price, and these food and fuel are actually mostly imported. And the third one is the dollar, how the dollar appreciate or is strong against the currency of our main trading partners, or depreciate or weak against the currency of our main trading partners. So we have to monitor this. Last year, for example, our inflation was very low, 0.5%. It was actually because of two things. One is because of the low food prices and commodity prices globally, but also to some extent, dollar strong against some of our currency of our main trading partners. So actually, that's a good one. This time around, with this external shock, the ongoing war, how these three factors play. Actually, we continue monitor how these three factors play against our, or now contribute to the inflation in the country. But I think in the beginning of the year with the central bank, given the history of our inflation, we set our inflation target to 2% for 2026. The government set for 4%. So we continue monitor how the shocks actually transmit to our economy and how it affects to the inflation. But the most important thing, which is for the medium to long term, we have to, because these two, especially commodity price, fuel price, actually external, depend on the import. I think we need to probably increase our productive capacity domestically so that we can probably try to match between the domestic demand and domestic supply, so that if we face external shocks, then at least we can mitigate some of these shocks by having the domestic production that could contain some of the imported inflations. So what I would like to say is that, well, we continue to monitor the shocks impact to our inflation. Right now, central bank role is, we say wait and watch. But in the meantime, also coordinate with fiscal authority to make sure that if there are any necessary measures that we need to take, we take it.
So, Mr. Roncaglia, based on your international experience, could you please share with us your perspective? What policies work best to manage rising prices, especially for food and fuel in small economies like ours?
So let me just add something that the governor said I think is very important. When you're talking about small open economies, the importance is you cannot avoid external shocks because you're not the country producing it. This is being produced elsewhere, be it because of conflict, be it because there is a monetary policy in the case of the Fed as a Federal Reserve that controls the dollar that is used here in Timor. But what you can do is avoid that these external shocks become social instability. And I think what the governor mentioned is exactly that. So every single instrument that the government can deploy to mitigate the effects, to cushion the effects on the population, they should do it. The problem, and I think the main challenge, is how to identify for how long you can do it and how wide you provide this instrument. You don't want to have people that have a lot of resources benefiting from something that is taken out of the government purse. So people that can absorb this shock in their own of budget, the family budget, people that are better off, they have more resources. Then these people, they have to weather this by themselves because they can. Now, the most vulnerable part of the population, they don't have anywhere to go. So they need the support of the government, and that's why the government has to tackle. And this brings me back to the issue of the fiscal. Now, the fiscal has to take care of things that are happening now, but it also has to take care of things that will happen in the future. And that's why we call economics the sad science, right? Because you always have to make very difficult choices, sad choices, in which you cannot attend to your wishes at the moment, because you're buying time, you're getting something in the future, be it for you and yourself in the future or the coming generations. So all that said, the first thing that is very important is that the fiscal framework be in place. It can help out the most vulnerable, but also sustain the economy in the sectors that are most important. Because when you have a shock, the tendency is for prices to rise and employment to fall, because activity tends to become less certain. So investment drops, and that's where the government can come in and help the economy to at least sustain a little bit of this activity. Now, what we don't want is that in this process that the money is wasted. What is wasted money? Either money that goes out of the country and never comes back, or money that does not create more opportunity, that does not circulate in the economy and creates jobs, creates more income, that makes entrepreneurs more confident about the future, so they employ more people, they keep producing more. Now, one last thing that is very important, and the governor mentioned, is how can we widen the productive base of the economy? The number of products that we produce inside the economy, how we deploy the natural resources of the country, and how we use the labor force that we have. So that's why in the midst of this shock, you need to have a strategy where to go, because the shock will hit you, but it's the framework that will let you know, how can I spend this money wisely now? Because the temptation will be there. The temptation will say, give money to everybody. Give money to everybody. Don't control this. But this is a trap, because once you go on that road, it's very hard to come back, because people say, hey, I continue to need it. I need more. And say, yes, but we need to go back to that path. So the framework, the fiscal framework in a dollarized economy, is perhaps the key instrument that the government had. That's why the connection to the petroleum fund is very important, because you don't want to lose all this money in a situation in which you can control the money and make it come back to you through the economy, by creating new jobs, by creating new activities. So finally, regulation is very important, be it through the financial system, to make the financial system what we call deeper. So think about a cup. The deeper it is, the more liquid it can hold. So this is more resources that families, that companies are putting in the system, saying, I don't need this money now. You can apply this money to open a store. You can apply this money to open a factory. And then in 5 years, I want this money back. But you have 5 years to use this money to create different opportunities. This is how deep the financial system is. But you need to regulate this, because the financial system does not necessarily know if a good opportunity is there, if it's going to work out or not. And that's where the central bank comes in and say, look, you have to have very clear rules of who you lend the money to, so this money creates opportunities, creates jobs, and makes the economy prosper. So going back and summing up, the fiscal buffer, financial regulation, and overall just the control of how you use the petroleum fund money.
Thank you. So there's certainly much more to discuss, but we're nearing the end of our interview. So before we close, I would like to ask you both one final question. What are the most important steps that Timor-Leste should take to build a stronger, more resilient, and more diversified economy? So let's begin first with Mr. Roncaglia. The floor is yours.
So she led the very difficult one first for me. So I think first one, the accession to the ASEAN, it's going to open a lot of opportunities. It's going to bring a lot of demand for investment here. I think this is very important because also being part of this concertation of countries will bring a lot of investment, but also an understanding of where the economy of Timor will fit itself in the wide context of countries. So this is very important. And I don't want to reduce the importance of this because I think it would open exactly a lot of opportunities. Now, where you go from here is very important. So I think one thing is very important is that for the key and essential sectors of the country, that you keep the control of these decisions inside the country. So something that my economy, Brazil, has already faced is what we call denationalization. So the control of the decisions happen in other countries. So you don't have, for instance, if you're taking care of the production of foods, stuffs, the decision is taking place elsewhere. So if you need food to be produced there, it might not be the interest of the company that is in another country. So you need to have that control inside. Now, it's not up to me to tell the authorities which are the key sectors, but the key sectors, in my view, should maintain a domestic control exactly because they're vital. So whenever a shock hits, the country needs to have the production system in place to help out the population. So food security is absolutely important, and this is something that builds resilience. So not to have your availability of food widely dependent of the shocks that happen elsewhere. This is something that needs to be constructed, okay? No country built this overnight. And again, I come from a country that is a huge producer of animal protein, of cereal, and we still have challenges in this regard. The second one is energy. So try to find diversification of energy sources so you can distribute the demand for energy depending on where the shock comes from. And energy is very important for the entire economy to function. And finally, to maintain what is your main asset in this regard, and again, I'll go back to the petroleum fund and your biodiversity. I cannot stress enough, we're entering a world in which biodiversity will be a very scarce good and asset. So the countries that have it, the countries that preserve it, will be paid for it. Not now, we're still building this, but eventually countries will be paid for having standing forests. This is the future I see. And these three issues that I brought will help build a more resilient economy. Now, a fully resilient economy, to this date, we have not known yet. So it's something that I think the next chapters will bring the challenge to many nations facing this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Roncaglia. Let us now turn to the governors to share his perspective.
Very important question, but I will approach this by a formula of 2-3-1. So two challenges. We have to tackle or address these two key challenges, the fiscal balance and trade balance. We still have the problem of high fiscal deficit and high trade deficit. So we need to make sure that we come with, as Mr. Andrea just said, that we have to have the fiscal framework, the aim for addressing the fiscal deficit in the future, and also we need to increase the productivity domestically to reduce the trade deficit. So the two challenges, the high fiscal deficit, high trade deficit, has to be addressed. I even say this is actually the two biggest disease that we have in our economy. We have to address this. And the three things, I call it the facilitation, three facilitations that we, the public sector, need to address, in order to facilitate the economy. So the first facilitation is invest in human capital. I think in the beginning we discussed about we have the demographic dividend, a lot of young people, which actually presents opportunities and also challenges, but looking at from the perspective of the opportunities, we have to continue to invest in these people, because this is actually the people that can contribute the productivity of the economy. The second facilitation is invest in infrastructure. Public infrastructures are needed to facilitate the private sector investment. And the third one is efficient and transparency of regulatory framework. You cannot continue doing the campaign of attracting private investment, either it is domestically or foreign, if you don't have efficiency in your legal framework, you don't have a clear or transparent in the implementation of your legal framework. So these three facilitation is important. Invest in human capital, invest in infrastructure, and making sure you have efficient and transparent legal framework. And the last one, which is I say 231, the last one is actually the objective. So we want the economy to be led by the private sector and focus everything on the private sector led economic growth. That is extremely important. Right now, our economy is driven by public sector, but we have to work together. Everybody have together to support the private sector development. That is extremely important. And we, the central bank, we need to make sure that our industry, the financial sector industry, is able enough, is robust enough, is deep enough to support the private sector development, so that we can have a resilient economy, inclusive economy, a diversified economy, and a sustainable economy in medium to long term.
Again, thank you both very much for joining us tonight and for sharing your insights. So tonight's discussion has highlighted something very important. While global challenges are real, Timor-Leste also has strong opportunities to secure a sustainable future through sound policies, strong institutions, and long-term planning. So with that, we come to an end of today's edition of Página do Governo. Thank you all for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time with more conversations that matter to Timor-Leste's future. Goodbye.